Okay. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So we are picking up where we left off in the last class. So if I remember correctly, we had just gotten through inspections and the final walkthrough part, right here, right? So we were at 7, 8, and 9, correct? Part of the contract. So 7, all of section 7 talks about the buyer's right to do inspections. And then it talks about how long they have to do those inspections, when they have to get their TRR in, how long we have to negotiate the TRR. And then I'm gonna pop quiz it when we are looking at the TRR being submitted. How many days do we have to negotiate a TRR and get all parties to sign the TRR? To negotiate it once it's submitted. 7 days. So on the 8th day, if we do not have all parties' signatures on that TRR, what happens? No.
They agree to buy as is?
No, that's if you don't submit a TRR, they agree to buy as is. If you submit a TRR and all parties do not agree and sign on the dotted line in 7 days, what happens? Day 8, so I've done my inspections, I prepared a TRR, I've submitted the TRR to the listing agent. 7 days have passed. We do not have a signed TRR by all parties. The listing agent could have crossed things out and sent it back to you and the buyer didn't sign the amended changes, or the listing agent could have just not sent it back to you signed. If it is not signed at the end of that 7th day, then what? Say it loud. The contract is terminated. The contract becomes null and void, and the earnest money goes where? Back to the buyer. Okay, so understand this is very, very, very important because your contract is now no longer a contract. It is null and void, completely gone. Okay, now there's a couple of different scenarios here. The buyer submits the TRR. They write up the 1-page TRR. Here's what I want fixed. They sign it. They send it to the listing agent. During this 7 days, that listing agent and those sellers have to either sign it as is, and all parties agree to everything that's on there, or the listing agent crosses things off. The seller says, I'll do A, B, and C, but I'm not doing D and E. They sign it. If they've made any changes to it, even though the buyer has signed the original and the seller has crossed things off and re-signed it, it's not valid because there are changes until the buyer signs off on those changes. Okay? So the buyer has to sign it twice if there are changes, and the seller only signs it once. Okay? If there's no changes, they each sign it once. But until all parties sign all revisions, it's not complete, and there's 7 days to get that done. Now, what Colt had said originally was about accepting it as is. That is true if we do not submit a TRR prior to the expiration of the inspection period. Okay? Now, let's just ask this scenario. So I say I have till the 25th. Today's the 21st. I have till the 25th to submit my TRR. And I decide to submit it today. Then I say, oh crap, I totally forgot to do a well and septic inspection, and I need to do that inspection. Can I, and then they find something in that inspection, can I add something to the TRR after I've submitted it? But I still have 4 days in my inspection period. Right. So But if you turn in your TRR prior to the end of your inspection period, so I turn it in on the 21st and my inspection period's not done till the 25th, it doesn't matter. You can't add things to it. Once you submit it, you submit it. Okay. So please keep that in mind before you submit your TRR. When you submit it as a buyer's representative, you must be done with your inspections. Okay. Now let's jump in. So that's inspections. Are there any questions? Because this is where most litigation comes around, is section 7 of the contract. Inspections, canceling contract due to inspections, wanting to get things inspected that we forgot to get inspected, missing deadlines, not getting TRRs. This is where most of our problems arise. Are there any questions around section 7? Okay. So section 8 is very simple. It says that the seller assumes risk until the day of closing. And then once we transfer ownership at closing, at that point forward, it becomes the buyer's responsibility. So if after inspections are done, we agree to TRR, if a huge hailstorm comes through and tears up the roof, who's responsible for that?
The owner.
Who's the owner? The seller, right? Okay, so they are responsible for it up until the day of closing. And the only exception is normal wear and tear, which we should not have substantial normal wear and tear from the 30 days we're in contract or the 2 weeks post inspections to closing, whatever the case may be. Okay, so they are responsible. And again, we've seen a lot of times the hailstorms come through and tore things up. And we may be dealing with a case where we have to go back after we've agreed to repairs and get a roof done. And those are exceptions to section 7, right? Where a catastrophic event happens and we have to do things outside of the inspection period because the seller is responsible for maintaining that property until the day of closing. Okay. And you will see sometimes, like when we have a big flooding event happen or a big storm event happen, where mortgage lenders will require and could delay closing because they will require, not when they say inspection, that means like the appraiser going back out and looking and making sure everything's all good. There's no flood damage, there's no visible storm damage, stuff like that, prior to them issuing funds on the property. So we have had that happen often here because we'll get those storms. And so anything that's pending, they will require, if it's post appraisal, pre-closing, they will sometimes require an appraiser to go out or somebody to verify that the house is in satisfactory condition. Okay, so risk of loss is up to, is belongs to the owner of the property or the seller of the property until ownership is transferred to the buyer. Number 9 talks about when ownership is transferred. So buyer, upon accepting title and possession of the property, they are accepting it in its current condition. There are no warranties, whether expressed or implied, that are provided by the sellers or any agents as part of the transaction. So what this means is that when they sign on the dotted line, they're accepting the property in its current condition. So this is very, very important that we do what before closing?
A walkthrough.
A walkthrough, right? Because it is, they are taking it as is. So if something's wrong and they do not do a walkthrough, then they're accepting it as is. They're accepting that property. Now, could some negligence come back on the agent, the buyer's agent, for not doing that? Potentially, right? It's very, very important. That's why we want to make sure we get that done. Now, when could something come back on an agent, even though it states acceptance of the property in its condition and it removes liability from the seller's and the agents involved in the transaction. When could something come back after closing on an agent or on a seller, even though we have this number 9 in there? When could a seller, a listing agent become legally responsible for something with the house?
If they didn't disclose something.
Yes. Now that's a very tricky thing, right? If the sellers knowingly inappropriately disclose something and it can be proven, they can be held liable.
We were talking about weather events. So let's say that I know that the roof has a problem over here, but rather than fixing it, it kills over and we paint it. And then you're gonna go, so if the weather happens, that's obvious that I doctored this up.
That could be potential. It could be, I mean, I have seen where people have known that they had an issue with mold, tried to self-treat it, didn't disclose it, got their asses handed to them because of it.
Well, my own house in Pocono, brand new house, came on one day, it was flooded.
Mm-hmm,
It had a hot water pipe, they put corking instead of capping
mm-hmm,
with a cork came out.
mm-hmm.
And came up with damages.
Right. So inappropriate disclosures, you know of something that's wrong with the house and you don't disclose it. You, I mean, we had a case where we had buyers that bought a house. It was a flip. We were able to prove that the seller had contractors out there. The contractors told them this is a problem. It was plumbing issues, mold issues, and electrical issues. We were able to track down all of the contractors that came to that house and told them there were issues. They chose not to fix any of them. They kind of did their own thing, covered them up. Those sellers had to buy that house back. Okay, so
Had to buy the house back?
yes,
What if you've already spent the money? Or what if they already spent your screwed you?
I mean, it would have had to go to court and the
Right.
courts would have had to handle it, but you know,
It's
so,
probably much cheaper than buy it
right.
back because it goes to court.
Mhm. Like it was, even just to fix those issues, it would have cost more.
Than what they-
Mhm.
yeah.
And then we had mold and health hazards and things like that. And I mean, it took a lot of investigative work to get from point A to point B, but we had enough to say, hey, we know that you knew this stuff and you covered it up and they bought it back. Okay, so that would fall on the seller for not properly disclosing known items. When can it fall on an agent?
You call them to do it?
If the agent knows and doesn't.
It doesn't disclose.
There is a form, or you can, at any time when you're representing a property, you can, and you are required per your code of ethics to disclose any material defects that you know that the sellers are not disclosing. So a great example of this is, say we do inspections. So we get the house under contract. Okay, so whiskey, you bring me a buyer, I have a listing. Your buyer does their inspections. We find out that there's structural damage, there's roof damage, there's mold, whatever the case may be. My buyer's like, I'm not going to fix it. I'm just going to find a new, or my seller says, I'm not going to fix it. I'm just going to find a new buyer. You cancel the contract. I now know that there's material defects with this house. I have to tell my seller they have to redisclose based on what was determined.
What was found.
Yes. If the sellers do not disclose, I am legally obligated to provide an agent disclosure of what I know.
And that goes into permanent record.
You need to attach it in the MLS. I mean, permanent record, it's in the
Well, I mean,
MLS,
So I do attach it myself to this list.
right, through the attachments in the
Through
MLS.
the inspection process, this was discovered and the agent did change the disclosure.
The agent, you mean
You
the
mean
seller?
Seller.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I wouldn't necessarily say the seller refused to disclose, but I would just say, you know,
This was observed.
this was observed during that, yeah, okay? And if you don't disclose and you know that, it could be very problematic. Now, some options around that are getting second opinions, verifying, because one roofer could tell you it's totaled and the next roofer couldn't, right? So you'd have to have enough evidence to state that what that buyer or that buyer's representatives and inspectors said was not valid, right? Or, hey, they said we had mold, we did a mold test, it doesn't have mold, or whatever the case may be. If you've taken the proper steps to either remedy it or disprove it, then you're fine, right? But if you as an agent representing a seller are informed of material defects that need to be disclosed and you do not disclose them and the seller does not disclose them, then you are just as liable, okay? And this doesn't mean don't show me the report, I don't want to know. Okay? That's not what that means. Okay, we have a duty to the public, okay? So that would be a case where even though it states that they're holding you harmless, that you could be held responsible for damages, okay?
What if the damage is a broken window and it's obvious to everybody? Do they still put that as disclosure that the window's broken?
Disclosure, the broken windows are not necessarily disclosure items.
Okay.
Disclosure items are mold, water in the plumbing, flooding, foundation, that kind of stuff, right? Hazardous materials, those kinds of things. So we're talking about the questions on the inspection, on the disclosure, okay? Okay, so are we all clear on 9? Okay, 10 is talking about title evidence, okay? So there's couple of different options, and it's the buyer's expense, but the buyer needs to either obtain title insurance or get an attorney's title opinion. Now, in pretty much all mortgage cases where they're obtaining a mortgage, you have to get title insurance because
Seller has a buyer.
no, this is for the buyer for their loan, right? They have to obtain title insurance in order to obtain that loan, because the mortgage company is not going to want to take on a property that is not guaranteed by title insurance. Now, what is title insurance? Can somebody tell me what title insurance is? Right. So in case there's a defect, but what is a defect? What could be a defect?
Missing hair, missing person.
In the chain of ownership, like, yep. Okay, what else?
Lead.
A lien. So we see this a lot, like a mechanic's lien that's filed on a property that maybe the seller had work done, didn't pay it. So any liens that were filed that were not paid prior to closing, this protects the buyer from the house getting a lien placed on it that wasn't their responsibility. A grandson coming out and saying, hey, I was the heir to this property and you missed me. So this title insurance covers that.
So does the seller ever get title insurance? Seller.
They get it when they bought, well, they'll have a policy in place when they purchase the property
Which ensures that there were no problems.
prior to their ownership.
The buyer has to do it just in case something comes up.
During that, yes.
During
The-
that
the-
ownership
yeah.
until sale.
Right, so anytime it comes into play, it's from that day prior. It covers anything prior. So then when like a seller buys the house, if I buy the house in 2019, December 1st, 2019, my policy is from everything prior to that. Now I go to sell it tomorrow and the buyers are going to get a title insurance policy that's going to go from that day all the way back. So if the defect is found during my ownership, right? But it happened prior to my ownership, then technically that would be between the title companies, but it would technically fall on my title policy when I purchased the property because my title
There's
company missed.
that,
Right,
But you're covered because. you-
right. That's why we get title insurance and not just do an attorney's opinion, because the attorney's opinion does not have any guarantee.
How does that work when, you know how people buy it like owner to owner, you still have on title insurance? and all that?
What do you mean owner to owner?
Right.
Like a
Yeah.
private sale?
Yeah, like a private sale.
There's a lot of risk in there. Like if it's just a cash transaction ownership transfer, and there's no title insurance, then no, that's why working with a realtor is very important, because these things like this get missed in those kinds of transactions. And I mean, anytime there's a mortgage involved, you're gonna have to have title insurance. So, because mortgage companies won't issue, I mean, this even covers like easements. I mean, I had one title company that wouldn't issue title insurance because there was a utility line that ran across the backyard. And I don't know how the hell these people did it, but they installed an in-ground pool right underneath the power line.
How fun.
Not at all. The property became unsellable completely until that pool got filled in,
Yeah.
or that power line got relocated, because you can't have an active power line over top of a body of water. Right. I mean, they couldn't have pulled permits, nothing, right? I mean, how did it was in Oklahoma City.
How'd they build that pool?
They just didn't pull pool
Yeah,
permits.
Nobody.
Nobody.
They just went in and put it in.
Who
Yeah.
has that kind of money just to throw like a?
Well, no, they probably weren't even told. The owner of the home said, hey, would you build this pool for me? You gonna take
Built
care
the
of
pool,
everything?
yep,
I'm gonna build the pool, I'll take care of everything.
yep.
And they just.
Yep.
Sure they weren't touching
Yep,
it?
I'm not gonna tell, yep, I mean, it was crazy, but like those, you can't get title insurance, you can't get mortgage insurance, you can't get title insurance, you can't get property insurance, it becomes completely unsellable property. But these are the things,
Title insurance, even if you're paying cash for something, right?
100%, and you always should buy
Yeah.
title insurance, no matter what. Always, always.
Yeah, because
Because option 2, attorney's title opinion, is just an opinion, like, I've looked at it, it looks good. Okay, put your money where your mouth is, right? Right.
That's an opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Because whoever you're buying it from, or that it's getting bought from, just because nothing got brought up or they had it.
Doesn't mean that it's good.
Right.
Right. I mean, we've had things pop up way down the line. They could not know that a lien's been placed on their property. Right. I mean, there's time. I mean, I've seen people have liens pop up and they were completely surprised. What is this? Where did it come from? It could have been a name error, because we have a lot of common name. I mean, there's lots of things that can happen.
The
So,
pool guy that put the pool under the power line, put a lien on it?
well, if he didn't get paid, he could.
Yeah.
He didn't pull permits. and just-
Well, no. I mean, he can't, no, not for his error, but he could, I mean, if he didn't get paid, he could technically put a lien, and he did work, so he would be owed that money. even though he did it. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So there's lots, but there's lots there. That's why it's very, very important to make sure we're getting the title insurance, and that is a buyer's expense. On the seller's side, the seller's expense within 30 days prior to closing agrees to make available a complete and current abstract. Okay, so that's done through the title company. The title company pulls the abstract and brings that up to date, or the title insurance policy issued from the previous purchase. And so again, and the code search certificate. So those things, understand, your sellers are not physically doing that themselves. That is their expense that they pay to the title company as part of their closing costs, and the title company obtains those things, reviews those things, and updates those things for the transfer of sale. But those are bringing the abstract up to date. All of that is a seller's expense, and those are the items on the cost of, or the net to seller sheet, that show up as the title fees on the seller's side. Okay, so buyers obtain title insurance, sellers bring the abstract up to date, and those are their expenses, making sure that the abstract is in good condition. Okay, so C, now this is buyer's expense typically. And this is where we're gonna determine the boundaries of the property. So we have a mortgage inspection report or a land or boundary pin survey. Okay, most cases, we're getting a mortgage inspection report, and that's gonna be, and we have title people coming in, they're gonna go over what each of them look like, but that's gonna be, it shows you all the liens on the property, any encumbrances on the property, any easements on the property, and then it has just a little sketch of what that plot of land looks like with the projected boundaries of the land. Now, when or why would we want to do a land or pin survey instead of the mortgage inspection?
The larger lots.
Is there a question in the property line?
We do see it a lot on larger lots. If there's a question on the property lines,
Fence was placed on a line.
that, yes, that those could be potentially something we need to get a pin survey, but a lot of times it's on larger lots where we don't know exactly where the boundaries are, or maybe a pin stakes were put in years ago and they're not exactly clear where they are, and we can't get a copy of that report. Those are when we want to do those types of things specifically, so that we can have very clear boundaries and understand the property that's being conveyed.
One question.
Mhm.
If most of the property in Oklahoma, sorry, gas and oil rights. So
Yes, these transactions are surface rights only.
okay, these are all.
Surface
so
rights
if you
only.
wanted to know, if your buyer wanted to know if these include, if this property includes the mineral rights, how do you find out?
That's all, you have to get attorneys
It'll be in the-
involved.
It'll be in the title work.
Right.
It will be in the title work, but like I said, in most cases, those are all reserved, and they were just transitioning surface rights. So
Most
if
of
we're
them
wanting to
haven't
get,
had it for 5 to 10 years
Yeah,
ago.
right.
But
Right.
that's when it's surface rights only, so from my source, farmland, it was in the surface rights only.
yeah, the contract is surface rights only. So if we are transferring anything besides surface rights, we need to get attorneys, real estate attorneys involved and get the appropriate documentation to transition mineral rights as well. Our contracts are surface rights only, and we should not be involved in that. We need to get the legal representation involved in doing anything beyond surface rights.
You'll run into it a lot more. in rural-
Right.
rural stuff. Someone's got 10 acres, they may somehow acquired their 10 acres.
Mhm.
Yeah, I have someone who wants to sell 40 acres of land.
Right.
in Podo Mountain, on Podo Mountain,
Mhm.
and they think they have mineral rights. I've called the Oklahoma Commission for Mineral Rights, and they said they don't show any activity on the
Remember
property.
you go to the county clerk's office, register a deed.
I went through before county. Before county said they don't have.
They're, so,
But are they looking for activity, or are they looking for actual rights, ownership rights?
Rights is what I'm looking for.
okay,
It's-
I can give you a number, I know some land guys that'll, they know how to find it.
Right.
They don't care about, that's what they look for, they don't.
But I have to pay a land, how much is it?
No, I can,
Okay,
well, just give me the piece, give me where it's at and I'll call them.
okay.
Be like,
What do you know about
who owns
this?
this?
Yeah, yeah.
Because I worked with them directly when I surveyed, they were in the same office.
Okay, cool, thank you.
And if there are mineral rights being transferred, we need to get additional people involved in that, not just realtor to realtor.
What it is.
That's what you did for
Yeah.
14 years?
Plan.
Okay.
Well, he can, you still have access to the websites and stuff?
But you do not need to be handling that directly. Yes,
But you basically gotta go to the courthouse and research throughout the time, saying your title insurance is perfect. That's what land is. You can go back and you can check you gotta check every transfer, because if somebody back in, 1902.
Right.
Then
nobody has them. They may think that they have them.
Whoever says they have them may not actually have them.
Right.
Yeah. The person that did hold ownership is dead and gone.
Well, but their
Yeah.
family, it will probably just.
It just goes to the heir, and whatever ownership rights that person had, they- yeah. right. So, Yeah. Yeah. and that's why title doesn't get involved in mineral rights. Okay. Okay, so but this is strictly for boundary, okay? And so like most neighborhoods are platted, very specific boundaries. A surveyor can come into a residential neighborhood and they can pretty easily tell if a fence is off. Pretty easily. So typically, even in those areas, pins are not necessary because they have the ability to, with those plat maps, to be able to tell if a fence is encroaching on another person's property. And they can tell if like the front 4 inches of the front northeast corner of the house is on a setback line. They can tell all of that, right? Now, what you'll get, and I'll have, when title comes in and goes through their documentation, I'm gonna have them bring some samples of where there's like a little encumbrance on a setback line or something like that. And let's talk to you guys about how those things are handled. But a mortgage inspection report will show those kinds of things. If we're unclear of the property boundaries, then we really need to get a PIN survey for that. Okay, they're a little bit more money and they take a little bit more time. So we need to plan for those things. Okay, any questions around those? Okay, so D, buyer's right to examine title evidence. Buyer shall have 10 days after receipt to examine the title evidence and deliver any objections to the title to the seller or the seller's broker. In the event that title evidence is not made available to the buyer within 10 days prior to closing, then the closing date shall be extended to allow the buyer 10 days to examine title evidence. Do we hear that? What does that mean? Well, the title work's done, but you, as the representative of that buyer, are responsible for getting them the title evidence at least 10 days prior to closing. And if you do not, the buyer has the right to request, has the right to 10 days from the date that they receive it. So you get the mortgage inspection certificate, you get all the title documents, you don't send that to them, they can push back closing. They have every right to push back closing. And the seller or the seller's agent can't do anything about it. Is that clear? You have an obligation when you get that mortgage inspection certificate to send that to the buyer, and the buyer has 10 days to review it. Now, if you don't get it 10 days, is the buyer going to push closing because of it? Not necessarily. Do they have to push closing because of it? It's not like the lending guidelines where if it doesn't happen 3 business days, you can't close. But all this says is that the buyer does have the right to push back closing if they choose to, even if it's the agent who just didn't send it to them. Okay. It's an automatic extension. Buyer agrees to accept title subject to utility easements, building and use restrictions, setback and building lines, zoning regulations, reserved and severed mineral rights, which shall not be considered objections for requirements of title. So this is just stating that this is the information that's going to be provided to them, and that they have the right to review it and either accept it and proceed, or they can, if they're unhappy with something that's provided in title, they can give the seller a time to clear that item or not proceed with the purchase.
Do you have them sign that?
No, I just send it to them electronically so we have a trail. Okay. Seller to correct issues with title if possible, and this is a built-in closing delay to allow the seller. So upon receipt by the seller or in care of the seller's broker, if any title requirements in the attorney's title opinion or the title insurance commitment basically show any issues, at the seller's option and expense, the seller may cure title requirements that are identified to the buyer. and it will delay closing for blank days, then it defaults to 30 or a longer period if agreed to in writing by all parties, to allow them to cure title. So by default, if you put nothing here, and most people do put nothing here, if something pops up, this gives the seller the right to have 30 days to resolve any issues on title. This could be a lien, like a tax lien, a mechanics lien. This could be anything that shows up on that title. They have 30 days default unless you change that to correct any defects in title. Okay? Any questions around that? So it is an automatic 30-day extension if there's a title issue. Okay? Okay, upon closing, any existing abstract owned by the seller becomes the property of the buyer. That's pretty straightforward. We transfer the abstract from the selling party to the buying party at the time of closing. Okay. Taxes, assessments, and prorations. So this whole section here talks about how things are prorated at closing. So taxes, for example, are paid when? They are technically paid at closing. Why are they paid at closing?
So it won't tag along.
Technically, so that the buyer is not responsible for the seller's taxes, but why? Why? Because taxes are paid at the end of the year for what year? The previous year, right? Exactly, in arrears. So taxes are due October, November, December of the current year for that year that you're in, right? And so from exactly, so from January 1 until whatever day you're closing on, the seller is responsible to pay those taxes. Well, we can't just let the seller go on their way and hope that they go in December and pay their portion of them, right? So taxes are paid at the closing table by the seller from January 1 until the day of closing. Okay, we get this a lot. Where does this rise? Where do we get a lot of questions around this?
Seems straightforward.
Well, it is straightforward as far as that concept, but what about escrow accounts on mortgages? What part of your monthly payment is principal, interest, taxes, and insurance? Right? So every payment you make as a homeowner, if you have escrow, which people typically have escrow if they are putting less than 30% down, they have to escrow those things. So they're already paying January payment, February payment, March payment, April payment, up their monthly prorated tax. It goes into that escrow holding account at the mortgage company. And then come December, the taxes are paid on their behalf. So sellers say, well, wait a minute, I pay my taxes in my mortgage payment and my mortgage company has that. Right? They are. So then you get, well, I'm paying them twice. Are they?
No.
Why?
They're covering the difference, right?
Not covering that? No, I mean, my mortgage payment takes my exact tax bill, divides it by 12 and takes out that exact amount every single month to my escrow account. So what I need for tax at the end of the year is going to be in there. At the title company takes the exact amount, here's the tax bill, divided by the number of days that you've owned it and pulls that exact amount. So I have that exact amount being taken out of my proceeds at closing. And I also have that exact amount in my escrow at the mortgage company.
Escrow is going to refund.
No, a few weeks after.
Okay, that's the key. The escrow is refunded to the seller. When is it refunded?
After
A
close.
couple of weeks after.
Couple of weeks after closing. Okay, so when your sellers are asking this, say yes, because there's no way to guarantee that would ever get paid for your ownership. Title requires And mortgage lenders require that it's paid at closing as part of a seller's closing costs. When you close and you pay off your mortgage company will then issue a check for all of those funds that have built up in your escrow account. And it's typically, if we close 6 months into the year, it's typically 7 or 8 months worth of taxes. And then whatever they've set aside so far for insurance, because like, we don't know exactly when. They could be paying their insurance in January, they could pay it February, March, whatever it is. So there's money collected for paying insurance and property taxes. So they're not double paying. It just gets refunded post-closing, and it gets refunded when the mortgage is paid off. Then that escrow is released. So what should we as good agents remind our sellers to do?
Not freak out during the back.
Not freak out, yes. But what else? Call the mortgage company, give them your forwarding address to send that check to. What else do they need to do? There's 2 phone calls they need to make.
The insurance,
Why?
well, because you're gonna have insurance that's already paid for, because the mortgage company typically is gonna pay that.
For the year.
in
Mhm.
advance, so.
Yeah,
You're
so
gonna get a refund for that, so you can give them your new, well, I mean, if you go with the same insurance.
if you go with the
they
same
should have-
insurance company, yes, but you still need to make sure that that insurance company is canceling the old policy, right? So you're gonna get 2 refunds post-closing. You're gonna get an escrow refund that comes from your mortgage company that has all the funds that are collected into your escrow account to prepare to pay taxes and insurance. And then you're going to get a refund from your insurance company for your portion of unused insurance premium, because you pay insurance for 12 months typically. And then if you're 4 months into your policy, you're going to get 8 months refunded. If you're 9 months into your policy, you're going to get 3 months refunded. So they should be potentially getting 2 checks back. Okay. And we need to remind them of that, because they're in the chaos of moving and buying and selling, and they never remember that. So we got to tell them, hey, cancel your insurance. You're going to get a check from them. Cancel your or when your mortgage company is going to close that account, you're going to need to give them a forward address to get your escrow refund sent to you. Okay. So this here is down to everything. It's doc stamps are calculated, utility bills. Obviously, you want to make sure they cut everything off. That doesn't get billed to closing, but the seller is responsible for paying everything up until the day that they close. And then the buyer picks up from that next day forward. Okay. So if there is an HOA, most HOAs you pay at the beginning of the year for the year, right? So if they've paid the HOA, then is the seller going to have to get a debit or a credit on their side for the HOA?
The seller
Yes,
is gonna get a credit.
the seller's going to get a credit because they've already paid it to get refunded for, because they paid for the entire year, and they get refunded for whatever portion of the year that they're not going to owe it. So all this section is saying is that anything that is tacked on as a fee, the seller is responsible for to the day of closing, and the buyer is responsible thereafter. And it is prorated down to the day. This is why settlement statements change even slightly if closing moves a day or 2, because everything has to be recalculated to that new day. Okay. So, hey, we're bumping closing a day. It's not just we're changing the date and rescheduling the time. All these numbers need to be reworked. Okay.
Have you, I mean, I'm sure you have, but like, for instance, last week, I got closing on Friday, pushed to this Friday, and these people like asked for, like, hey, we want $1,000 on the TRR, because they butted their inspection period like literally right after closing. I felt like they knew what they were doing.
Mhm.
They did that. But long story short, they asked for $1,000. For what? And so they submitted a TRR. I mean, it was all kind of.
Well, I mean, the TRR could have been like, even if it's silly stuff, they're just asking for credit for that. But as far as getting a credit for delaying closing,
I mean, I didn't want to like submit it to Keith and get a new DA and go through that whole rigmarole, but they were kind of like, I mean.
The only time you have to get a new DA is if the purchase price changes.
Well,
If
that's
you're
what-
giving them a credit towards closing costs, that doesn't change, or if,
I guess that's how we could have done it, but
Yeah.
that's what we did. We just changed, we changed from, 250 to 240.
and so if we're ever talking credits,
Yeah.
try to not credit purchase price unless you exceed allowables.
Okay.
Okay, because $1,000 credit towards closing costs is a lot easier to handle than $1,000 change in purchase price than everything I mean, that could impact, if it's a mortgage, the lender. It could impact, title company, as opposed to just giving a credit towards closing. The only time you can't give credits towards closing is if you've already paying some and you're exceeding the max allowables.
This buyer is so difficult to deal
Yeah.
with. And I didn't want to lower the purchase price because I live in that neighborhood. like,
Yeah.
we feel
Well,
like-
and that's why it's also for comp purposes,
Yeah.
it's better to just do a credit to closing costs.
Yeah, what are we doing, lady?
Well, that's what you get paid on.
Right. Right.
Oh,
So
right.
you gotta change DAs, you gotta change loan documentation, as opposed to simply credit. It's a lot easier to change a seller credit
Yeah.
to the buyer, giving them $1,000 towards their closing costs than it is to change the loan amount. Okay? But that has nothing to do with taxes, assessments, and prorations.
Right. no.
This, if your closing changes a week, everything will just be reassessed based on that new date, whether it's in arrears or not,
Right.
who gets credits and everything like that, okay? 12, what is 12? What is a residential service agreement?
A warranty,
What kind of warranty?
home warranty.
Home warranty, okay. So, oh, for the love. A is very straightforward. There is no home warranty. Okay, nobody's asking for a warranty. We're not guaranteeing a warranty, nothing. B is the seller already has a warranty in place and they're transferring it to the buyer and the seller's paying for it. C, this is where it gets fun. C is stating that the buyer is requesting that the seller put a warranty in place, or the buyer is going to get a warranty. So if I write in here, the property shall be covered by a residential service agreement or a warranty that is selected by the buyer at an approximate cost of $650. That's all I put in there. What does that mean?
It's a buyer plan.
That means that the buyer's paying for that policy. That simply means that the buyer wants policy. I'm just letting you know I'm putting a policy on there and I'm paying for it as the buyer. The seller agrees to pay X amount and the buyer pays the balance. This is where you're actually asking for the seller to pay for the home warranty. Okay, I have gotten contracts where it has said $650 home warranty in the first blank, and in the second blank, it was left blank. And then when it showed up on the buyer's side of the settlement statement, the buyer's agent calls me and says, hey, we agreed to a home warranty. You said you were buying a home warranty. We didn't agree to pay for a warranty.
That's a.
Okay.
We're gonna put a pool under that power line.
Right, right. Now, you're the buyer's agent. Your buyer says, I want the seller to pay for a warranty. And you only fill in blank 1 and you don't pay in blank 2.
You were not buying warranty out of your commission.
The buyer's agent will be paying for a warranty out of their commission because your buyer told you that's what they wanted and you did not do it. Okay, we clear on that? Okay, so it doesn't mean anything as far as financial responsibility to the seller unless it's filled in both spots. And it's totally okay to split it. You can put a 600 and put 300. You can do whatever. It's totally okay, but just make sure if you want the seller to pay anything, you're filling in that second blank, okay?
Just make sure if you want to get your offer accepted, you don't put anything in there right now because they say no.
Very true, very, very true. Okay, additional provisions. This is an open text field that we can put other verbiage that we need to into the contract. So I've seen the escalation clauses in here. I have seen, I'm not gonna ask for repairs in here. I'm just going to state that if you're gonna say as is, or I'm not gonna ask for repairs, you be very careful on how you word that. And you can put it in section 13. We just don't want to word it as though we are voiding our inspection period, because I've seen some that could potentially negate an inspection period. So we just want to say buyer will not ask for additional repairs. We don't want to state anything regarding not doing inspections or anything like that. We really should never say we're not doing inspections. We should always simply just state we're not asking for repairs. Just because we have a responsibility to still try to protect the buyer. And so we always want to encourage them to, and we don't want to write it in here and say, oh, we're not going to do inspections. And then they decide they want to do inspections and we've already said we're not doing it, okay? The next section is for mediation. So this just states that should a dispute arise, we will try to resolve that dispute through the mediation system in the area that the property is located. Any settlement agreement shall be binding. So whatever is agreed to in mediation is a binding agreement. And then if a agreement is not reached, then they can pursue legal remedies provided in the contract. Okay. All states is we agree to try to hold hands and sing Kumbaya before we go fight it out in court. Okay. Okay, breach. The seller or buyer shall breach the contract if either fails to comply with any material covenant, agreement, or obligation within the limits, in the time limits and requirements of the contract. Time is of the essence in this contract. If there's a breach by the seller, if the buyer performs all of the obligations of the buyer and the seller fails to convey title or fails to perform any of the obligations under this contract, then the buyer shall be entitled to either cancel the contract and terminate it, return the abstract to the seller, receive a refund of the earnest money, or pursue any remedy available by law, or equity, including specific performance. Okay, or is very, very important here. It says that they can cancel the contract and receive the earnest money back, or they can pursue legal action. If you receive earnest money refunded back to you, then you can't pursue legal action. One or the other. Very, very important. People get all caught up. I want my earnest money back. As soon as you accept that earnest money, even if it's $500, you can now you've lost the ability to perform or to pursue legal action. Okay. So if the contract is canceled by the seller breaches the contract. If the seller breaches the contract, do not sign cancellation of contract and do not collect the refund of earnest money if you plan on taking that to litigation, okay? Because you are then agreeing to the cancellation. Okay, upon breach by the buyer, if at any time prior to closing, the buyer's earnest money should fail or not be delivered in pursuit of paragraph 2, which talks about delivering the earnest money, then the seller can elect to cancel and terminate the contract by providing the termination notice, or pursue remedy available by law or in equity, or enter a written agreement that modifies the terms of paragraph 2 to cure the lack of delivery of the earnest money. If after the seller has performed their obligations in the contract and the buyer fails to provide funding or perform their obligations in the contract, then the seller may, at the seller's option, cancel and terminate the contract and retain the sums paid to by the buyer, but not exceed 5% of the purchase price as liquidated damages, or pursue any other remedy available by law. Okay, so the seller can't agree to refund to collect the earnest money and then go after them in court. This is again an or situation. You cannot get 5% and then go pursue them in court for specific performance. It's one or the other. Okay, you can't sign cancellation of contract, collect the earnest money, and then take them to court. Okay, and if we get to this point, we need to get the broker involved and our office attorney involved. What I will tell you is, anytime the buyer and seller are pursuing legal action against one or the other, that is between the buyer and the seller and not you. You actually are no longer involved in that. Okay? The buyer is suing the seller. They are the parties to the contract. You as the realtor are not a party in this contract. Okay? Okay. Incurred expenses and release of earnest money. The buyer and seller agree that any expenses incurred on their behalf shall be paid by the party that incurred them and shall not be paid by earnest money. Okay, so that earnest money's in there. If the buyer's done inspections and the contract busts, we can't write that that earnest money goes to the inspector to pay the inspector. The buyer's still responsible for paying their incurred expenses, and they're agreeing to that in this contract. So if the buyer ever tries to push back on that, they've already agreed to those expenses, and that's their responsibility. Release of earnest money. In the event a dispute arises around the release of earnest money that is held in escrow, then they shall retain, the escrow holder shall retain the earnest money until a written release is executed by both the buyer and seller, and then it can be dispersed according to that written release. An agreement of disbursement is reached through mediation. So we couldn't agree, we didn't, then we take it to mediation because we all agree to go to mediation as part of this contract, and the mediator gets everybody to agree to what happens. That's legally binding. Interpleader or legal action is filed, at which time the earnest money shall be deposited with the court clerk. So interpleader is the next step that we would have to go to handle a dispute in earnest money if we can't handle it through mediation. Or there's this passage of 30 days from the date of termination of contract. Now, the problem with this is title companies do not deal with 3 and 4 typically. So there are title companies that have earnest money from 5 years ago because nobody signed a agreed to release of earnest money. They don't deal with this. Most of them won't, at least. So it's totally up to you, but your broker can handle 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we'll handle them. We'll take interpleader, right? We'll do the 30-day, deliver them a certified letter. If they don't respond, then release the earnest money. Okay. But this is very, very important to understand. That's the difference between holding title, having title hold earnest money, and having your broker hold the earnest money. Is the broker will do these things. In most cases, title will not. Okay.
So do you think it's a better idea to leave the earnest money at title?
I think it's more secure holding it at the broker's office. I do think it's a little inconvenient because you always have to come pick it up and take it prior to closing, because you have to pick it up from here. They cut you a check to the title company to take it to the title company the day of closing, but it does provide a lot more protection. Okay. And then 17 is the buyer and seller authorizes their respective brokers to receive counter offers, deliver offers and counter offers and addendums on their behalf.
That's one of the.
Yes.
Isn't, like, if both parties are notified, like, from our office, and there's basically no response, and the broker makes the determination.
Broker makes the determination. Yes, and then they'll cut the check.
If they're active, they're in agree and nobody responds back, then our broker makes the decision for it.
Right. Yes.
So I've been in your.
Right, because we have a little bit more power, because title company will not make that decision, period. I mean, they won't hold it. 18 just states that you have to make sure that the seller is legally allowed to sell the property and that we're following federal guidelines. And then all offers must have a termination date and time. So we see this a lot with like these highest and best now extending things. It's very important that if we're breaking these timelines, that we get it agreed to by all parties, that we are okay with extending these timelines. And then the very end is simply buyer and seller's information, and then listing broker and selling broker's information. Any questions? Okay, it is our lunchtime. So everybody's gonna come in here. We're gonna have lunch in here. And hi. and we will go from there. Yes. All right. Thank you. We're gonna get this audio fixed so we can hear you guys for the next class. I hate this. Thank you. Bye.